Well, good morning once again. We will get started here and allow other people to kind of join us as we get going. I am Mark McGill, the Director of Member Relations for the South Bend Regional Chamber. I want to welcome you to our Solutions for Success today, Serving with Purpose, Lessons Learned as a Nonprofit Board Member. Really excited about this one, so thank you for joining us. As with all of the programs that we provide at the Chamber, none of it is made possible without the great partnerships that we have. And I always say that I love all 1,300 of our chamber members, but there are some that are just terrific partners and are always there to help, whether it be the golf outing or things like this. And Sim Financial Advisors is a great chamber member, great chamber partner, and they are responsible for providing the solutions for success. So we have Evan Stark from Sim Financial with us this morning. I want to welcome Evan and have him say a few words.
Good morning. Glad to be here and glad to learn more today as somebody who has served on nonprofit boards and can sometimes feel a little bit lost. I love that there's professionals in our community like Kyle that can offer some insight. So I'm excited to learn more today. Sim Financial Advisors is one of the largest independent money managers in the country. We have 75 employees working on growing that to hopefully 90 even this year. So excited about the growth that we've seen. We love our communities that we serve. We offer independent financial advice and investment management across pretty much every category. If you've got a question that touches finances, estate planning, taxes, insurance, there's somebody on our team with alphabet soup after their name that can help. So we'd love to talk to you, and we're glad to be here with the Chamber.
Right, Evan. Thank you. And thank you again for your friendship and your partnership because it really means a lot to us. A little bit of housekeeping. I want to mention our Salute to Business luncheon coming up on February 27th, 1,000 people or so at the Century Center. This is kind of our big marquee event. Sells out every year. Pete Pavakwa, who is the athletic director at the University of Notre Dame, is going to be our keynote speaker, kind of a fireside chat with our president and CEO, Jeff Ray. Always a terrific, terrific day. So you can find more information on that at the website, sbrchamber.com. But if you want to join us for Salute to Business, I would do so quickly. I think I saw we're north of 800 people already. And so you can check with JC in our events department to see if there are tables left. But if you want a ticket for Salute to Business, February 27th at the Century Center, I would take care of that sooner rather than later. Our next networking at lunch is March 4th at the Pepsi Stadium Club at Four Winds Field. Joe Hart, the president of the South Bend Cubs, will be our guest. Will give us a chance to take a peek at some of the renovations happening at the ballpark and some of the things that are planned for this year and the years to come, not just at Four Winds Field, but the entire area of the city is really transforming. And I'm sure Joe will spend the better half of his time talking about how great the on-field MC is at the ballparks. I hear that guy is just money. One more note, our third house meeting has been rescheduled. That's where we meet at the History Museum. All of our delegates, our legislators locally, will give us an update of what's happening with the Indiana General Assembly downstate. We had to reschedule from the 28th of February to March 7th. So make sure that you note that schedule change. The legislators were busy on the 28th doing legislator stuff, so we moved it to March 7th. So make sure that again you make note of that. That's a great hour at the History Museum where you just get to learn what's going on. Of course, having a new governor, a lot happening down at the State House. So that's a really terrific day as well. So March 7th. I want to remind you we have a podcast series here at the Chamber Behind the Region. Jeff Ray and I host the podcast. We release those every Friday in our second season, I believe. If you would like to be on the podcast or know somebody who should be a guest of ours, please let us know. We would love to chat with you on the podcast. Again, just get a hold of me. And then anything else you need on the membership side, please get a hold of me. We love working on your behalf and are here to serve you. I want to introduce to you now Kyle Chamberlin. It might be easier for me to tell you what Kyle hasn't done and what Kyle hasn't been involved in, but he's an attorney with THK Law. He's also, he was part of Bradley Company, and he was also the in-house counsel to Gurley Leep Automotive Group. But what I love about Kyle the most is his commitment and dedication and passion when it comes to serving local charitable and civic causes, which is why he's with us here today. Kyle is currently serving in his second stint on the board of the Community Foundation of St. Joseph County. He's a past chair of the Mishawaka Housing Authority Board of Commissioners. He was previously on the executive committee here at the Chamber, past chair of the YPN South Bend Advisory Council. Both he and I have just aged out of the 40 under 40. It's close, but we're not welcome anymore. He was a past board member of the South Bend Civic Theatre, president and treasurer, Hannah and Friends neighborhood, the Northeast Neighborhood Council, and the Coalbush United Methodist Church. So Kyle has done a lot. We are thrilled to have him. Kyle, we know you're super busy, so thank you for your time today, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Mark. That's probably a kinder introduction than I observed. If anybody isn't seeing my screen, please jump in and say so. So I titled this, and you know what, I failed to say thank you, Evan and Tim, for making this possible while the Chamber facilitates the sponsors to do the heavy lift to make events like this happen. So we all appreciate you guys making today's event possible. I call this serving with purpose because we are specifically talking about nonprofits, and except in the rarest of circumstances, there's no financial remuneration at the end of the day for these types of board roles. Though I would argue there is a lot of benefit, not just to the community, but to you as the director or volunteer. So I want to keep that kind of nonprofit-centric theme in mind through my remarks and any conversation we may have. It's dangerous to give an attorney an unfettered microphone, and I usually like to make things as conversational as possible in person. So I hope we can replicate that today in our virtual environment. Feel free to jump in with any questions in the chat, and Mark's going to flag those for me. And if I offer you a response that just totally didn't understand your question, feel free to unmute yourself and say, "Hey, dummy, that's not what I asked." So the more conversational we make this, hopefully the more worthwhile it will be for everyone. I kind of was preempted in my first few slides here by Mark's introduction, so I'll skim over the why I'm talking today and who I am. I'm a townie through and through. I've lived the entirety of my 40 years in the confines of St. Joseph County. I grew up in Mishawaka and was a Mishawaka caveman. I went to Notre Dame for undergrad, and then for what I call Peter Pan reasons, namely that I didn't want to grow up and get a real job, I stuck around and went to law school. I found myself for 11 years working as an in-house attorney at a commercial real estate firm here in South Bend called Bradley Company. That's where I first became involved with the Chamber. And another thing I appreciated about my time there was it was an organization that was externally focused. And while I was busy with my day job, they always made it clear that I was allowed and encouraged to carve out the time to participate in a lot of great civic organizations. And I've found a similar culture at my current law firm, THK Law here in South Bend. And I tell people I'm not Atticus Finch in what I do, right? I primarily represent businesses wearing my day hat. But what I'm passionate about is kind of my night job of being able to utilize some of those legal and governance skills in serving many of the great nonprofits that we have here in Michiana. So, Mark kind of already covered this, but to the extent that I have any qualifications whatsoever to be sharing thoughts with you today, they were lessons learned, right? There's no class in law school or manual about what it looks like to be, I would argue, an effective board member. There's a lot of kind of primers on what is the role of a board. This isn't that, right? You can get that anywhere on the internet. You can read that. This is more about lessons that I've learned. And some of them are going to seem fairly macro level in a way that I probably wouldn't have appreciated, when I was first starting out serving nonprofits. But I think I've come to recognize more over time, looking for the root causes of things and thinking about governance and process does matter. I mentioned earlier we are focusing specifically on nonprofit directorship, while some of the underlying concepts are the same. If you were a director of a for-profit corporation, it's a different lens through which you might be approaching things. Also, everything I say is the opinion of one person here, and I tend to be a bit of a contrarian, so feel free to disagree with me on any point. And then just to keep things moving, I decided in the spirit of David Letterman to kind of present today's remarks as a top 10 list of lessons learned. So this is the only racy joke you're going to get from me today. That's my 50 Shades of Grey. And that's my entree into saying everything you ask a lawyer, the answer tends to be, it depends. And so there's a lot of derivative questions in what we're going to talk about, and very few one-size-fits-all answers. So this is, like I said, one man's experiences, and maybe something in there will be a nugget that you find useful. So let's start at the highest level of what the board does, right? Who is the board of directors of a nonprofit, and what's their role? The most important thing there, I think, is saying that it's a strategic role, not a doing role. Now, there very well may be situations, particularly in smaller nonprofits, where it's what people call a working board. I would argue all boards should be working, but what they really mean when they say that is, well, you're also going to have to pay the bills and show up to clean out the supply closet and provide the services of the organization. And that's okay, and sometimes that's necessary. Some organizations don't have the budget to have any paid staff. But what you need to separate out in your mind as a board member is, what hat am I wearing, right? And understanding that when you're sitting around the board table or convened as a board, you need to be thinking strategically, not thinking about the minutia of the day-to-day programming. It's important to understand the programming, but you don't necessarily have to be doing it, right? The board performs, at the end of the day, the chief executive function, right? There are no owners of a nonprofit who sit at the top of the governance pyramid. It is the board. It's also important to understand that sometimes you delegate that function, right? We'll talk a lot more about the role of the executive director at a nonprofit later. The board performs a fiscal oversight function, right? It is the duty of every board member to perform this function. You can't just be, well, I'm not the person who does the numbers, I'll just defer to my colleague who works as an accountant by day. No, every single board member has a fiscal oversight function. That doesn't mean you shouldn't depend and rely upon those who have particular expertise here, but everybody's responsible for finances. The board in many organizations performs a revenue generation function, right? While some nonprofits have revenue streams through services provided or governmental grants, a lot of nonprofits in our community, the primary revenue generation stream is going to be donations. And as a board member, I would argue every single person around that table is responsible for assisting in that effort. And that kind of ties into, you're a community champion, right? You're an ambassador of the organization. I know when I get a request for a board, whether maybe it's in a committee I sit on where we are making grants to nonprofits, or if it's a potential client, one of the first things I do is I poke around and try to find a list of the board of directors. Right? Like, I want to know who believes in this organization and who's championing it. Like I said, this is lessons learned. It's not a comprehensive, so we're going to jump around from topics. The most important committee. There are several standing committees that most nonprofit boards will maintain. Usually there's some type of fundraising or development committee. There's usually some type of finance and or audit committee. There might be a programming committee. There might be an executive committee that hires and is responsible for relationships with the executive director. But I'm going to argue that none of those are the most important. In fact, I'm going to argue that a committee that 15 years ago I might have told you, oh, that's just the backwater, that's just something you have to do. And that's the nominating committee, which might go by any number of names, but it's who's responsible for going out and sourcing their replacements on the board, right? Their board colleagues. Unlike in a for-profit corporation where the members, the shareholders, get to choose the board, in most nonprofits, the board selects the next board members. And I've come to realize increasingly, including through a few situations where I was serving organizations or advising as their attorney organizations that seemed like they were stuck in neutral, that the single most important thing is who's in the seats around the table, right? And if you don't have the right folks in those seats, maybe you'll make some incremental progress, but it's never going to happen. So I would argue the most important committee is the nominating committee. How about you as the board member? One thing I also learned the hard way is that a passion for the mission needs to be a prerequisite to you accepting any board role. When I was first out of law school, I was eager to help, and I went around town knocking on doors saying, I want to be on the board. And I jumped at the first couple opportunities that I had. And I dove in earnestly for a while, but I fairly soon found myself not giving it my all, not being as effective board member as I owed those organizations. And the reason was because while they were good organizations with worthwhile missions, it wasn't something that aligned with my passion, right? So yeah, that's good work. It's not what gets me out of bed in the morning. So I very recently turned down an opportunity that on its surface looked like an interesting board to serve on. It would have frankly been a lot of great networking. I probably could have provided them some benefit, but I knew that their programming just wasn't something that I was passionate about. So I've learned that lesson through experience, and I would encourage you to always keep that in mind when opportunities do come up. Make sure you're selecting the right one. 10 or 12 years ago, I participated in Leadership South Bend, Mishawaka, and we had a presentation day kind of on nonprofit community. And I remember somebody specifically saying, you should never serve on more than 2 or 3 boards at a time. And I kind of scoffed at it at the time. I thought, well, they just don't know what I can do, because I think I was presently on 5 at the time. In retrospect, this presenter was right. And part of that is probably phases of life. When I was single and didn't need as much sleep as I do now, right? I probably could give a little bit more than I feel like I can give now, while also still being fair and giving attention to my marriage and otherwise. But I do think that at least at the board level, 2 or 3 is probably the maximum number of organizations you should be serving at any one time. That doesn't mean you can't be involved in committees or volunteering other places, but to perform the full fiduciary functions of a board member and be attuned to what's going on, 2 or 3 probably ought to be your maximum. And then what do you bring as a potential board member, right? There's some kind of broad buckets here. Do you bring expertise in the mission of the organization and its programming? Do you bring financial expertise? Do you bring fundraising expertise? Do you bring relationships, which is related to the above, but not necessarily the same, because there's a lot of people that have relationships that are terrified of asking those folks for money and don't know how to go about it. Do you bring just general operational expertise? You're the facilities guy. You're the person who knows everything about insurance. You understand HR. Or do you bring governance experience? Oftentimes this is looked to kind of the lawyer on the board, although I would argue it's really something that everybody should endeavor to understand. Ideally, as a board member, you can check a couple of these boxes. Very few people can check them all, but if you can check 2 or 3, now you're getting into the conversation of essentially being a valuable contributor to a lot of different avenues of the organization. What I also didn't add here, but what a good and forward-thinking organization will keep in mind is what perspectives do you bring, right? So these are expertise, but what perspectives do you bring in the community? Your lived experience, your demographics, et cetera. And then just kind of this little post-it note here of, are you a doer or a decider, right? And that doesn't have to be a binary proposition, but if you think, well, I'm more of a doer, right? Maybe board service isn't necessarily the best use of your talent, right? Not everybody has to be on the board. Organizations need a lot of volunteers in a lot of other capacities. You might be an excellent member of the X committee and a volunteer on something else and serve an organization for decades in that role and provide great value without ever being at the director level. If you're somebody who likes to think strategically and be more of a decider, that's probably a profile that fits the board role better. So a couple just this or that. These are bifurcations of miscellaneous topics, but they're ones that I've seen commonly misunderstood. Right? And I'm actually advising as their attorney right now, not as a member of their board, an organization that didn't know they were a member-governed organization. Right? I have a problem. We're working on fixing it. But in Indiana and in most states, there are 2 types of nonprofits. There are member-governed nonprofits, and there are board-governed nonprofits, right? I mentioned earlier that usually the board selects itself, but that's not always the case. There are nonprofits, many of them in our community, where the members have the power to to elect the next board. I tend to argue that it's not the best structure. I think it's in some ways a product of a different era when people, had membership cards and viewed themselves as members of this fraternal organization or that society. And that meant something tangible, and they showed up to the annual meeting. What I've seen in a couple of the membership organizations where I have served on the board is the only people that showed up to the annual meeting were the board, right? And so then it becomes really easy to just kind of forget that the members exist at all. And how do we define what they are? And are we actually keeping proper membership roles and all those things? So that's why I tend to think it's maybe a dated structure that I don't necessarily advise, but it's really important to understand to whom do you answer? Because if it's a member governed organization, ultimately the answer isn't just the community. The answer is to the member. They're like the shareholders of a for-profit corporation. So you should always understand that before you go on a board. Is it member governed or board governed organization? And honestly, if the organization doesn't, if the executive director doesn't immediately know, that's a little bit of a red flag about where they may be from a governance standpoint. Another thing to understand is that not all nonprofits are truly nonprofits, right? So it was mentioned earlier that I served on the housing authority of the city of Mishawaka. I made the mistake of telling the mayor I would serve where needed, and he took me up on it. But it is something that I happen to have some expertise from my day job. But it's not a corporation at all. It's not a nonprofit corporation. It's this quasi-governmental body created by a state statute, right? And so it is therefore subject to all the open door laws, right? We can't just as, like if you serve on a school board or a city council, we can't just as board members talk about something in the hallway afterwards and make some decisions and get together for lunch on the weekend, right? We are subject to the public access laws, no different than if we were the State House of Representatives or the South Bend Common Council. And so that comes with very different modes of operation, but also different duties, right? There, I don't necessarily represent the organization. In some ways, I represent all the taxpayers, right? All of us that pay income taxes are, indirectly paying for the federal funds that, makes the Mishawaka Housing Authority and its operations possible. And so I look at my role there as, kind of like a congressman might, as the steward of the public dollars, right? That's a very different role than I play for the Community Foundation of St. Joseph County. And I'm just going to give a quick reminder, don't hesitate to jump in with questions as we go, particularly if you have something that's specific to one of these topics. So generally only attorneys get excited about talking about governance, but I would argue everybody should care about it, even if they're not excited about it. Just coincidental timing, I had lunch earlier this week with the CEO of one of the largest nonprofits, not just in our county, but in the state. And this individual was jumping up and down about how much they cared about governance. And I said, that's awesome, I concur, but it's not a common thing I hear from executives. Now, this is somebody who grew up, if you will, in the nonprofit space, right? And I think saw over the 30, 40 years of his career why it matters, as opposed to somebody who maybe grew up in sales and is more relational and just wants to, have good conversations and then do stuff. But I think he agreed with my position that governance matters, and he emphasized it throughout his organization. And they have a very successful organization, right? Not just in the short term in their mission performance and their balance sheet, but also in the long term in their strategic vision. And it allows them to grow and serve the community. Governance is a couple things. It provides a deliberative process, right? There's a reason that it says in the bylaws that you have to introduce something this month but you can't decide on it until the next meeting, right? Or whatever strictures you may have. That sort of kind of room to breathe, I would argue, leads to better decisions. Governance also answers, in some ways, the most important question of who decides, right? And we're going to talk a little bit more board executive interface here later, but it's important for the board to remember that at the end of the day, it's usually the answer to this question is them, right? And they have to be the tip of the spear, and the buck stops with them. but having clear frameworks of who gets to do what, who can decide what, how it gets decided, what the function of the committee is versus the full board, what authority the executive director doesn't have. Those all lead to better decision-making outcomes. In the same way that I talked about the deliberative process, I think rules of procedure matter, not just because they lead to better decisions, but also because they help with risk management. Quite frankly, if you go into a board and it's kind of talking and nobody's following whatever rules of procedure they have in place, whether that's Robert's Rules of Order or otherwise, that's a red flag, not just as to the sophistication and effectiveness of the organization, but frankly, a red flag as to your personal risk for being there. The organization is just doing things, but not properly acting as a corporation in the manner prescribed by law and by its own internal governance. You're potentially breaking down some of those protections the law creates for you as a director versus an individual in your personal capacity with some liability. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then I think something else to understand is the importance of the bylaws. And I put in parentheses there, it was kind of like little text and articles, because there are basically two texts that are required to exist by state law and govern the operation of a nonprofit. And there might be additional policies, but the two main ones are the Articles of Incorporation, right? That say what you are and that you exist. And those are filed with the state and they're available for public inspection online. And then there's the bylaws. A lot of places know what their bylaws say, but I found that a lot of organizations kind of forget about their Articles of Incorporation. In fact, I run into projects where people ask me to assist with their bylaws, and I look at the current version and find that it actually has something that directly conflicts with their Articles of Incorporation. And by law, the Articles of Incorporation are kind of the supreme document, right? Like they're the most important document. And then the bylaws are kind of what fill in the blanks after the Articles of Incorporation. So as a director, I would say the first thing you should do when accepting a role to serve, or maybe before, is read the Articles of Incorporation and read the bylaws, right? Not everybody has to be the expert that is, saying point of order, but everybody should at least understand the basics of what's in the bylaws and do their darndest to ensure that the board is compliant with them. Another topic I hear a lot about is what's the ideal size of the board, and oftentimes when I'm helping people set up a new nonprofit, drafting their initial bylaws, I'm asked this question, and I always say I don't know, right? There's a wide range depending on what you do, what size of staff you have to support the board versus are you really looking for bodies to do work like we talked about earlier. But there are a couple concepts I've encountered that I think are relevant. When I was on the South Bend Civic Theatre board for several terms, we went through some really difficult periods in the organization where we were pretty darn close to tossing the keys to the theater building over to First Source Bank and saying, here you go, right? We throw in the towel. None of us wanted to do that, right? But the fiscal reality was that we were within a few days of needing to do that. And we had kind of a come to Jesus conversation with someone who had previously served as a board member but had accepted a volunteer role as the organization kind of interim CFO. And if anybody knows Chris Lauber, I hope she doesn't mind me sharing her name, but if you know Chris, you'll know that she's kind of a no-nonsense person. She's not one who speaks in flowery languages and worries about feelings. And I remember something very specifically she said in that conversation with the board was that we had a royal we problem, right? If you're familiar with this term, the English monarch historically has a habit of saying like, well, we are going to fight this war and we are going to endure this travails, right? And what they really mean is you, right? All of you. So we, but I'm probably not going to be doing anything of that. And I found that with larger boards, there is a tendency for the royal we. Boy, everybody, we really need to raise more money. It's easy to say that in the meeting, but what are you going to do the next morning after the meeting about that? And so for that reason, I tend to think smaller rather than larger makes sense, right? Something in the 7 to 13 space for, I would say, most local nonprofits seems to make a lot of sense to me. You get much more than a dozen, and it's pretty quickly evident that, some people are never showing up because they don't feel like they need to be there because there's plenty of other people there. The exception to that would be if your board really has a different role. And that's jumping to this second bullet point here. The University of Notre Dame, which generally I would argue is a fairly effectively governed organization, has like 40-some people on their board of directors, right? But there's a board of fellows that's 12 board members, and their unique circumstances, actually 6 of those are delineated spots for priests from the Congregation of the Holy Cross, and the other 6 are lay people. That's who actually hires the president. That's who has the authority to do most of the big decisions, right? The board on the whole has folks that I'm sure are excellent board members that bring wonderful perspectives, but it also has a lot of folks that write really big checks or have relationships that can get other people to write really big checks, right? So they have kind of an executive committee model of, okay, yeah, we've got this really big board for ambassador purposes, but the actual governance happens with this 12-person body. Another way you might see organizations address that, and this is also something that Notre Dame does in addition to that, is, hey, we've got the 7-person board, and we know that that doesn't include our best and biggest longtime fiscal supporter who everybody knows in the community and who we think there's value to having her serve as an ambassador of our organization. But she's the chair of our advisory council, right? And so maybe you've got the folks who are the strategic, focused, governance-minded, and a small group as your technical board of directors. But then you have this other body, the advisory council, the leadership committee, the community champions, whatever you call it, that maybe meets 2 or 3 times a year, and they're the ones that you call on when you need to sell the tables at the gala, and you need to get an introduction to the person who can write you a big check, and you welcome their opinion, but they're not necessarily being asked to take on the full board member role. It's also a great opportunity to get people who could be really beneficial champions of the organization, but maybe don't have the time for a monthly or even a quarterly meeting. So I've seen that employed to great effect, and I frankly wish more nonprofits would invest in something like that. So your single most important charge as a board member, the one job that you have to get right, is one that might come up once every 20 years, or maybe once every 6 months, but that's hiring your executive, right? And the role might have different titles at different organizations, but for here, let's just call it the executive director. Okay. I've got this kind of little side Venn diagram here of the best scenario is a strong executive and a strong board. Right? On the gray circle, I've never seen an organization with a strong board but a weak executive that ultimately succeeded in fulfilling their mission. There's a question mark. I've seen some organizations with strong executives but weak boards that for at least a while did good work, right? Because the executive was holding it together. The slippery slope there is it tends to become a fiefdom. I've encountered a couple of those as a new board member where the board was just along for the ride and the executive was really the boss. But obviously the ideal situation is you've got a strong board and a strong executive. They are, in the vast majority of cases, your one and only employee, right? They work for you as the board and only they work for you as the board. That's kind of a quick reminder to not be trying to micromanage their selection and evaluation and leadership of the rest of the staff who ultimately flows up to the executive director. That doesn't mean that you can't be available for counsel, right? You can't be available as a sounding board in their leadership duties, but you have to be careful that you're not implementing your will and undercutting their authority as the leader of the staff. It's really hard to work for a group. Most people in their careers never do that. Most people have a boss, right? But if you are a nonprofit executive, you have 12 bosses, right? For that reason, I always encourage something in the bylaws that gives the board chair or president or whatever the role may be called some level of authority to act as the direct supervisor, if you will, for the executive, right? So some delegation of the board's collective authority, certainly not the selection, the hiring, firing, right? Like those big picture decisions need to still live at the full board level. But I think it's important for the executive to have a person that they can call and say, how am I doing? I've got this question. I want to let you be aware of this, without feeling like they have to communicate everything to the full board. Be careful with friendships, right? It's not uncommon that we volunteer with an organization or appreciate an organization and get to know its executive and then become something like a friend. And then we're later asked, because of our love for this organization, to serve on its board. That can be a slippery slope. I'm going to have a real pressing question on this, I think, in a later slide, but be prepared to honestly ask yourself before accepting a board role, if you have a pre-existing friendship with the director, or sorry, with the executive director, what is that going to look like for you and for them? Similarly, maybe you don't know them at all, but through your service on the board, you become friendly with them. That's okay, that's not discouraged, but you need to, at the end of the day, remember your duty that you're an employer and they're your employee, and keep those boundaries when necessary. Last one is just kind of an ancillary point, but I see, or I've encountered quite a few organizations, particularly in my practice of law, that have employment contracts, like written employment contracts for a term of years, like we might expect to see with a football coach or a public company CEO with their executive directors. I'm not sure why this is so common in the nonprofit space, other than historical practice. But I would bet if we did a show of virtual hands here, most of us as employees are not guaranteed X years of employment and to get paid for that, whether we're doing a good job or not. So it seems to be more of a precedent, a practice, than anything anybody's ever been able to justify for me. And I've found that it's not a market demand in the way that it might be for an NFL coach, right? No NFL coach is going to take the job without the contract. But I've been in this situation several times the last few years where we've offered and received an acceptance from executive directors without employment contracts. So I kind of jump up and down whenever I find out that a board has an executive contract to encourage them to reconsider that with their next director. It doesn't mean you shouldn't have a clear written delineation of how they're going to be compensated and what the expectations of the role are and how they're going to be evaluated, all those things. You absolutely need those, like you would want to have with any employee. But I just don't see any compelling reason to commit to a term of years with anyone. It takes away the flexibility that you otherwise have as the employer. We have duties as directors, right? Everybody kind of says, oh yeah, of course, I represent the organization. I'm a fiduciary. And I think a lot of times people think that means like you have some sort of fiscal responsibility. It's much broader than that, right? Like it means you must set the organization above all else. There are actually some specific, in Indiana, statutory obligations, right? A black and white law enacted by the legislature of what you owe to an organization. So if you serve on a board and you've never read Indiana Code 231713, I would say you should. I should probably read the whole thing, because there's a lot of information there that I frankly see getting regularly misunderstood and or ignored. And it's kind of one of those, it doesn't matter till it does things, right? This is the lawyer in me, right? My job is to assume the worst case scenario and how that could play out. But if you aren't following your duties as prescribed in state law, you may also not be able to avail yourself of the protections the state law sets up, right? So the law wants to encourage people to serve as directors of a nonprofit without fearing that they're going to somehow be liable when the nonprofit can't pay its bills, or when it gets sued because, God forbid, somebody died at a program, or whatever the case may be. If you aren't meeting those duties, you potentially lose the ability to take advantage of those protections. So it's important to understand what those obligations are. Last but not least, never ever, and there's no reason to not be militant about this, never ever accept an appointment on a board without first saying, can I see a copy of your current D&O insurance policy? Directors and officers insurance, right? Every nonprofit should have directors and officers insurance. If they don't, run away, right? Like, or be committed to jump in and help them, get the ship sailing in the right direction. But this is an important insurance policy so that when the organization gets sued, which some are more at risk for that than others, but anybody that has any type of facility or in-person programming can certainly get sued for somebody falling down on the ice or whatever on a day like today. But usually this tends to, when the directors get involved, is, hey, we think that funds were misappropriated, or we think that the board did a poor job of stewarding the resources. There was anybody, this is public record, so it's something I can talk about. I don't have any knowledge of it as an attorney, but there was when Madison Center, if anybody recalls, the major mental health provider here in St. Joe County, kind of folded due to fiscal challenges about 15 years ago. All of the directors, the entire board, was sued, right, by the bondholder on a lot of the real estate projects that they had done. Had they not had directors and officers insurance, each of them would have had a pretty hefty check to write for their defense, right? So make sure that you see a copy of the board's directors and officers insurance and understand that it's there, and that it's, I tell executive directors a good practice is to every year when it gets renewed, send a copy of the policy around to the board so that they all just have the comfort that you're on top of it, it's being carried, the premiums are being paid. This is maybe a simplistic, childish statement, but no moolah, no mission, right? I mentioned earlier that I think all board members have some responsibility for fund development, particularly in those organizations where fundraising is the primary source of revenue. This doesn't mean that in order to be a good board member, you have to be somebody that can go out and ask for money, right? There are roles for people who don't have that comfort or that skill, but there is a counter argument to that. I hear some people say, if you can't do that, then you don't believe enough in the organization, right, to be making that ask. This isn't asking for money for you. This is asking money for this cause. And if you don't believe in that cause so strongly that you want to share the opportunity to support it, then maybe you're not the right person for the board. I don't know that I necessarily feel that strongly about it, but I do feel that everybody has a role in it, and that everybody has a role in the oversight of it, right? We can't just say, oh, well, next year we really ought to raise more money. Hey, executive, try to raise more money next year. No, it needs to be an active part of your board conversation, in the same way that if you were operating a factory and there were no orders coming in, right, and there was no revenue coming in, like it would be a 5-alarm fire. That's the only thing your executive team would be talking about is how do we get money. It needs to be the same way at the board level, right? Like if the revenue is not covering the expenses, that is the only issue you should be talking about until that situation is rectified. This is kind of a general topic, but one on which I seem to find myself often involved. And I think that's for a couple of reasons, because I'm the lawyer, right? And also because I don't know if maybe I don't come from a default state of being soft around the edges, right? Like I'm probably a realist that maybe has more willingness or more comfort with some than asking difficult questions. And what I've found that to mean, and this is not an indictment of any of the organizations that I'm currently on by any means, but I found that to mean is I seem to keep getting asked to serve on boards that need a turnaround person, right? And then pretty quickly, I find myself 12 months in the middle of an executive director termination meeting, which if you've had to terminate someone's employment as part of your day job, you probably agree with me that that's just never a pleasant scenario. It's something that I read leading into the meeting. It's just not a fun thing to do. It sucks for everybody, if you're doing language. At least when you do it for your day job, you get paid for it, right? Like I found myself in a couple of those meetings as a volunteer. It's not fun. And I have that side note there, jumping back to what I said earlier. Are you prepared to fire a friend? Right? You need to ask yourself that question if you're thinking about joining a board where you have a friendly relationship with the executive director. You may have to fire that person someday. Are you prepared to do that? And that doesn't mean that you would literally have to be the one in the meeting. Obviously, the whole board doesn't usually sit there and have that conversation. But you're going to have to vote on the decision, right? And I've seen that very thing strain friendships. Fortunately, I haven't personally been placed in exactly that scenario myself. Why does it get to that? It seemingly with maybe more frequency than we even see in the private sector. I think a couple reasons. I think it comes back to this notion of having a group as a boss, right? And it's hard to course correct when you only see your 12-headed boss once a month or once a quarter, in the same way that is when you have a boss at work that you interact with every day, right? So I think it's easier for executive directors who may be well-intentioned and maybe even fully qualified people to stray from the expectations of the employer. I think it's because there's a lot of weak boards out there who defer to the executive, like I mentioned earlier, and it just speaks to them, and they just assume whatever they say is great because they've been doing it for a long time, and then it's all great until the house of cards comes tumbling down. I've encountered one of those for sure. And in fact, I encountered one where the executives, I think, for years have been actively hiding information from the board, I would argue, and in some ways, I hate to throw around the term too callously, but in some ways bullying the board into not asking probing questions. And then I think that there's just a lot of inertia, right? You went to this meeting at the end of the day at 6 o'clock, and you already had a long day at work, and oh man, I didn't like what we heard, but are you going to jump up the next morning and call somebody and say, okay, what are we going to do about this? Or are you going to just think about it a little bit and then show back up at the next meeting and say, oh man, didn't like what we heard again, right? It's easy for there to be inertia when it's not something that directly affects us every day, and it's not something, quite candidly, that affects our pocketbook, right? If I'm the owner of a company that's not making money, that's a problem that I have to address the next day. If I'm a volunteer director, how, if at all, do I feel the pain of the organization not performing? Something else I think leads to this, or maybe just that is not great, is all unanimous votes. I would say this, yes, adopting last month's consent agenda that includes the minutes, right? Great, that's fine, it's unanimous every time. But there needs to be more contrary votes, right? If there's not, then I would argue one of two things is happening. Either the board is just highly deferential to whatever the staff proposes, and okay, fine, agreed. Or the board's not fulfilling its full purpose. It's not taking on tough enough questions. It's got the wrong issues before it. Let's think bigger. What can we talk about that we disagree on? So don't be afraid to be the person that votes no. I tend to do this a lot. Sometimes maybe I'm just, I don't know, maybe I'm just doing it to needle people to make a point. But don't ever feel pressured to vote yes on something when you think there's a better option out there. And particularly with our private nonprofit corporations, as most are, there's no public record of the minutes, right? It's not like at a city council meeting where then you got to go out and face the cameras and explain why you were the country. You vote no, it goes in the minutes. Nobody outside of that room knows, right? So there's not a lot of risk or downside to being the one who votes no occasionally. I would encourage you to consider doing it more. And then I'm jumping around the bullet points, but building a consensus. I've found a couple organizations that I've stepped into that I mentioned being challenged, and I was like looking around the room at the first couple meetings, thinking like, am I the only one that sees this? Like, we're in the red, it's going the wrong direction, the staff are all quitting, how does it? But nobody's asking hard questions. And what I found is sometimes you got to be the one that leads and builds that consensus offline, right? Maybe a lot of people have been thinking the same as you are, but don't know if anybody else is. They're afraid to bring it up. They think, oh, well, everybody else really loves the executive. I can never ask a question that impugns their credibility. Right? Call people. Hey, can we sit down for coffee? I'm trying to figure out where we're at with the organization, and there are some things that concern me, and I'd like to get your perspective, right? I mentioned South Bend Civic Theatre earlier, and I kind of found myself as the leader of the charge to make some difficult decisions. And this is exactly what I did. I probably had coffee with 7 or 8 people down at Chicory Cafe over the course of 60 days to get to the point where we even said at the board level, okay, we need to have a committee that kind of explores our fiscal situation and ultimately make some decisions with respect to our executive. And I found there were a lot of people who agreed with the concerns, but were afraid to be the first one. So rather than just throwing it out in a meeting and asking people to be the next one to raise their hand, start having those conversations offline with your fellow board members. So that's my prepared content. It looks like we do have about 10 minutes left for questions, and I know nobody will argue with getting out of school early, but I'm also happy to engage in a dialogue or whether you have questions or you want to tell me something you totally disagree with what I said, that's great too. Or maybe you have an example where you've encountered one of the concepts I talked about that you'd like to share. I'd love to hear any of that.
Kyle, what do you think is the secret sauce for the number of board members? I've been involved with a lot of nonprofits. We had 13 board members. We've had 6 board members. We've had 22 board members. I mean, is there a sweet spot as far as board members to be the most effective board?
I'm punting to slide 5 again, the lawyer answer. Um, I do. I tend to come down from most organizations in that kind of 7 to 11 range. You get much smaller than 7, and because the state minimum in Indiana is 3. A nonprofit corporation has to have at least 3 board members. You get much smaller than 7, and it starts to get difficult to check off these different areas of expertise. Right? There's few people that meet more than 2 or 3 of those with any level of significant experience, and so in order to cover all of your bases there, I think 7 is probably the minimum-ish. But then you get much more than a dozen, and that's when we get into kind of the royal we problem we talked about. I tend to think 7 to 11, unless you've got some structure that otherwise divvies up power. If you've got a board of 50, but it's an executive committee that meets quarterly, and then you've got an executive committee of 6 that gets around every month and really keeps an eye on things, that can work too.
And you kind of touched on this too, but I've been involved with boards, as have you, I'm sure, where people get on the board, but they don't really want to work on the board. They want it for a resume builder or to say, hey, I'm on the board of so and so. So again, if you're going to get on a board, be prepared to do the work, right?
Yeah, and when you're on the nominating committee end of that, if you ever find yourself in that position, be candid with people about that on the front end, right? Hey, this is what this looks like. This is what we need from you. We fully understand if that doesn't align with what you can give right now, but know that we have these expectations. Take attendance, right? Some of the more effective boards I've had on, literally keep an attendance chart at every meeting, and they follow up on their. A lot of nonprofits have in their bylaws, if a director hasn't attended at least X amount of Y meetings, right? And they follow up on that. And it doesn't mean that they instantly kick them off, but you follow up with a letter. Hey, just looking over our records and notice this, maybe this isn't the right time for you, right? And you're going to usually get 1 or 2 answers to that question. It's never a fun letter to write, but honestly, I found that more often than not, it's some level of relief expressed by the person. You're right. You gave them the out that they had just been kind of kicking the can down the road of telling you that they weren't up to this or it wasn't the right time for them. Or sometimes they say, you know what, I hear you. I want to do better, right? Rarely is anybody, when I've initiated that conversation as a board chair, rarely is anybody ever been like, how dare you, and had some sort of adversarial response, right? A lot of times you're giving them the permission to step away so that you can find somebody else that's better aligned at that stage in their life for the role.
Right.
Now I get that some boards don't have people knocking on their door, right? Some people are just trying to keep a full board, right? I get that it's not always that there's the next man in, and that's a fine balance to strike.
Yeah. You put your contact info back up so people can have it. Also, we're going to email this presentation out to your email, so you will have this here within a little bit. Boy, Kyle, thank you for today, but thank you for all your work in the community. It really is what makes the community better, are people like you. So thank you for all that you do to better the area that we live and work in. We appreciate you. Evan Stark, I love you, my friend. Thank you for your support and your friendship and for being a terrific partner with the chamber.
Happy to be here. Love it.
We will see you at Salute to Business February 27th. If you have any questions for me or anything on the membership side, please get a hold of me. There's Kyle's information. He'd be happy to chat with you. And if you have anything for Evan, as he mentioned, he's got a team of people that can help you out. sbrchamber.com is our website for any other questions. We thank you for your time today. Thank you for your support of the chamber, and a special thanks again to Kyle and Evan. Thank you, guys. We'll see you soon. Okay.
Thanks, everybody.